I recently had the opportunity to travel to Spain to learn more about the Cannabis Social Club culture and recent regulatory changes. In Spain, the Cannabis Social Club model for cannabis distribution is well established and is based on a decriminalized model in which commercial cannabis operations are prohibited, but personal cultivation and use is decriminalized. In the Cannabis Social Club model, clubs can cultivate cannabis on behalf of their members while also providing social spaces for it to be consumed. While exploring Barcelona, I noted many similarities between the Cannabis Social Clubs in Barcelona and developments in the social cannabis clubs in South Africa, which brings me to today's guests, Marleen and Brett, who have co-written the Private Cannabis Club Framework Manual for Setup and Management. Hi guys, how are you doing this morning?
Morning, Tidi. Good, thanks, and yourself?
I'm well, thank you. I tried my best with the introductions, but if you could also cover a bit about your work and what exciting things you've been working on, particularly in this space, that'd be great. We'll start with you, Marleen.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thank you also for this opportunity and finding what we say relevant. You know, it's important for us that the work that we do is seen out there and it actually helps and makes a difference. So getting the word out there of what we're trying to do is really important to us. So we're grateful for this opportunity that you're giving us as well. So Tidi, as you rightly said, my name is Marleen. I used to be a teacher that found myself slowly crawling over into the cannabis industry and trying to find a space for me to make a real difference about what I'm passionate about. So I recently started my own company called Cradlestone Quality Solutions. And I basically specialize in setting up the operational management side of private cannabis clubs, and then also assisting legal cannabis facilities with their quality management system requirements, so global GAP, GMP standards, applications for hemp permits and the like. So that's sort of where I'm at in the industry now. The book that we wrote that you've mentioned, here it is. And this was done with my good friend Brett, who's just absolutely brilliant. And initially, he was just going to consult for me and sort of review what I've written and amend it so that I'm sticking within the boundaries of what is capable and what is allowed. And eventually, he ended up contributing so much that it was just fair for me to make him a co-author on the manual, to also just give him that acknowledgement of all the hard work that he's done for me. So right now, Brett and I work together pretty closely on setting up cannabis clubs. Brett, obviously, from a legal perspective and sorting out the legal agreement side of it. And then myself working off of what Brett has built to create an operational quality management system to help clubs just record all the evidence that they need to record and manage their club in a really efficient and functional way.
Thank you, Marleen. And Brett?
Thanks, guys. Yeah, thanks, Tidi, for inviting us to do this podcast and video with you. It's always awesome. You know, we met quite a while ago at Canatech in 2019, I think, and just being in touch the whole time and doing something like this now is really awesome in collaboration with you both. So thanks. As I can only ditto what Marleen has said. In terms of the opportunity, you do wonderful work on your channels and it's just great to be here. And thanks, Marleen, also for such flattery. I'm humbled. Yeah, so I've been a legal advisor in the cannabis space for around 3 or so years now, consulting to firms and clients alike, and working both, in the various streams of the legalizing cannabis industries, so the medicinal, more recently the industrial and private use, until such time as the recreational industry is commercialized, which I suspect we'll also talk about in this podcast, and more recently working with Marleen on private cannabis clubs a lot, on the manual itself, which I was again humbled to be included as a co-author. Her work ethic and her understanding of systems has just been a real inspiration to me, and to work together from a legal side where plugging into the systems is critical for my understanding, and it's been a real a learning curve. So of late, I guess, where people entering into the cannabis industries is concerned, the club as a means of lawfully distributing for private use has really started picking up in South Africa. Oftentimes it's very difficult for people because of obvious kind of economic reasons to enter into the medicinal industries. It's largely, multi-million, often multinational corporations who can only do so. The hemp industry is obviously picking up now. It's got lower, easier restrictions or less barriers to entry. But the private cannabis club model is a space where we're really starting to specialize, and it's very exciting. And so it's awesome to be here to chat with you about it here today.
Thank you, Brett. Now, I think a good place to start would be the legality of the cannabis social clubs, because that is the starting point. And to my knowledge, we're still awaiting the judgment from the High Court regarding the Haze Club and the legality surrounding that. What is your view? Maybe I should start with Marleen regarding the legality of the cannabis social clubs and what maybe a court should consider when evaluating such associations.
Sure, it's actually a question you should start with Brett, because it's this is his specialty, but I can explain it from my perspective and then hand over to Brett to just round it off nicely, as he always does. So the situation that we're in right now with cannabis clubs in South Africa is that no one can tell you that a cannabis club is legal, and no one can tell you that a cannabis club is illegal. This is a new concept that the government and the courts and the legal system in South Africa has not had a chance yet to evaluate based on the merits that we've built it on. So this is a completely gray area that we are operating in, although we have really firm and strong arguments for what we believe we are allowed to do. And that's the part I think I'm going to hand over to Brett. And just a note on the Haze Club case, it is set to take place on the 6th of June. I don't know if it will be again moved out. I haven't received any news on that. But again, even if that order does come through, let's say best case scenario, excuse me, and the court says, yes, Haze Club, what you are doing is completely in line with the privacy judgment. That still leaves us with just one model that has been evaluated and been declared to be in that space, whereas we're working with a multitude of models in the industry right now that all need to be evaluated for us to really know what is the way forward for private cannabis clubs. But the main legislation that we have to really work with is the privacy judgment, and that's really the only thing we have. So at the end of the day, the more in line your model is with the privacy judgment, the better your chances should be of having a successful model. But I'm going to hand over to Brett to get into the technicalities of the legislation that we're making use of to base our various models on, and what our thinking is behind just constructing these models also for the industry, for people at the end user consumer level, to make it something simple and practical for them to utilize in their cannabis consumption life.
Okay, thank you, Brett. You could go ahead and tackle the legal questions.
So thanks. Yeah, the Haze Club, the THC case. It's obviously we're all in support of Neil Liddle, and who's the director there, and his legal team there. It's a very important struggle they're going through in the courts, with obviously huge potential criminal ramifications for those involved. So we all wait with bated breath, with the luxury of seeing what happens. And in that case, obviously, the Haze Club, as we understand it, is a model in terms of which, at least initially, the member of the public, sorry, there's a reflection in my glasses, let me take them off. The members of the public will come forth with their propagating material, their seeds or clones, or maybe be donated that, so that from right at the beginning, there's no transfer of cannabis. So to avoid the continued prohibition against dealing in cannabis. So the club member individually approaches the club with their propagating material or donated propagating material. The club then assists them or grows on their behalf. That itself is an interesting legal distinction, which we can talk about, given what was mentioned in the Prince privacy judgment. And then the club then assists you to grows your cannabis on your behalf, your crop on your behalf. It is tagged 100% along the way. So from planting to veg to flowering, it says this is Stephen's plant, etc. It's supposed to be perfectly tagged along the way, which creates a very sophisticated kind of SOPs or quality management requirements or technology requirements. And then at the end, the member then either arranges themselves the delivery or personally collects all of their yield, right? So that is the model that, according to the Hayes Club's papers, as I understand it, they're putting forward to the court, for the court to then determine whether that is in accordance with the Prince privacy judgment, and obviously skirting the prohibition against dealing in cannabis in Section 5B of the Drugs Act. So to do those two things simultaneously is what essentially the court is tasked with doing. I understand that the SAPs, the police and the Minister of Justice, in their responding affidavits, have come forward with some factual discrepancies. So they're actually claiming that the Hayes Club, I think, doesn't in fact sells propagating material. So there'll be a lot of these factual things that the court will have to determine before actually getting into the beautiful, intricate legalities as to whether there's dealing happening from a legal perspective, and as to whether they're operating within the confines of the Prince judgment, which is essentially a decriminalization of private cultivation, use, and possession by adults. Mm-hmm. And we wait and see. As I say, there'll have to be quite a lot of factual things determined first, because if just on the facts, the court determines, for example, that the model that they put forward is not factually happening, then the Hayes Club would tragically perhaps lose on the facts, and we might not get a legal determination at all. And so we're hoping that we get that legal determination, and that legal determination says, firstly, that once the facts have been adjudicated, that it's in accordance with the spirit and letter of the Prince judgment, and that potentially growing on behalf of another is not in conflict with the Prince judgment, that many people don't have access or the ability or the resources or the time to grow by and for themselves, and therefore why should they be differentiated against irrationally, or even potentially discriminated against, depending on the grounds of discrimination under the Constitution, and therefore should definitely have access to these to a club or association set up to do so. That model, as far as mine and Marleen's kind of conceptualizing of potential models that we think a court might accept, because we're reading into a gray area here, would kind of conform to what we would call a personal or private model. So that, as I say, the member comes acting individually. There's no greater social purpose necessarily. They are contracting with a club individualistically via lease agreements, horticultural services agreements, and maybe subscription agreements to individually access those rights, the cannabis-based privacy rights in the Prince judgment. They're not concerned with what's going on around them. It's their plant that's growing very specifically and tagged along the way on their behalf, or they have a means in or a hand in assisting the cultivation of, and that would, I think, largely kind of conform with that model, although we're wary of saying this cannabis club conforms with this model in terms of what we think, because that would be arrogant. I mean, we've got these models, but it would largely, we think, kind of conform to that kind of model. There's two separate distinct entities, a natural person and a legal person. So a person wanting to have cannabis, and a club that's or just a company that's there to assist in that cultivation, and there's no social or greater purpose. On the other hand, we've also conceptualized a type of model which we call a shared or collective model, which we think would kind of match with, and we've been inspired by the NCOD guidelines for cannabis clubs, and that's where you have shared cultivation and shared consumption, shared cultivation of the crop. And that's not about an individual coming to an entity, to a system individualistically to exercise their rights to privacy in the cannabis realm. There's a shared concern happening. Everyone's variously contributing to the grow, to that cultivation. And the consumption might be at a club space, it might be at home, but the point is there, it's a joint or collective and shared contribution via membership fees or perhaps other resources via cultivation of a joint crop, which is then proportionately distributed and equally always owned by the membership base itself. There's no transfer of ownership of cannabis from inception. And that would, we think, potentially skirt the prohibition against dealing, because there's no transfer of cannabis in the first place. And lastly, just to mention that model, what we'd call a shared or collective model, I think represents a departure from or development of the personal or private model, because it's based, in addition to the right to privacy, to access these rights and to cultivate and consume cannabis, the right to freely associate, which is also equally entrenched in our constitution in section 18 of our Bill of Rights. As the right to privacy is entrenched in section 14 of our Bill of Rights, the corollary, and we would say indivisible rights in this respect, would be the right to freely associate in order to access privacy. And we would rely on the jurisprudence of our constitutional jurisprudence in that regard, on the right to freely associate, to argue that there's actually no reason why the right to privately cultivate and consume cannabis should in any way logically preclude the right to do so in freely formed private associations. And so therefore it would be a development of that jurisprudence and potentially require at some point judicial pronouncement. Although we do think it's firmly grounded in a legal resource, namely the Constitution of South Africa, we would benefit greatly if a court would say as much very specifically. And those are, like, I think generally the way we kind of think about modeling and how we would assist client, we set that out in the book very clearly, and how we might assist clients, and maybe that contextualizes the Haze Club in a way in terms of this kind of thinking.
Okay, no, thank you, Brett. That was a very clear and detailed explanation. And one of the key issues that I've seen that has been raised has been whether or not the THC model or similar models create space for illegal activities. I think that's the main argument that is always cast to try and maybe discredit having a social club set up. But from just this discussion, and maybe some of the initial research I've done, it sounds like generally they're very well organized. To some extent, they're also a bit intimate, because it's also sometimes membership is also based on a particular group. Say the three of us know each other, and then we can invite along someone else. So it's not like anyone can just join randomly. So in some way that means that you are interacting and also setting up such a structure with people that are maybe already within your circles and within your community. So what are your views regarding this, underlying argument that's always posed maybe from the justice side, that such models can easily be penetrated or used as a way to cover up maybe something more insidious?
Okay, I'll give that one a go, Tidi. I think that if there is space for illegal activity to take place, and if there is a will for illegal activity to take place, it's going to be difficult to stop it anyway. But the point of the clubs are exactly to move away from that. So we're trying to, like you said, the heart of it is really the community coming together. So for me personally, from my perspective, it's really important that at least the initial base of people that come together to form this club, that these people are all interlinked with each other and connected, and that's truly the heart of that initial movement, is like, let's help each other because we know each other, we can contribute different things and get to the same goal together in an easier way. So the purpose of the quality management system, and like Brett said, the tracking and tracing and the proof of ownership, those are all things that we put in place to try and prove and give body to the argument that I'm not dealing in this club structure. So a very clear thing to understand from the start is that there will be no cannabis coming in from outside of the club into the club's ecosphere, and no cannabis from within the club that is cultivated within the club will go outside of the club sphere. So you have this closed loop supply and demand system. And one of the principles that we follow when we approach this design of the club is that supply has to follow demand. And we got that from the NCARD model, which is really, it's a strong argument, man, to prove that, listen, I didn't grow 16 hectares of cannabis and now I'm trying to get rid of it. First, I'm trying to find out from my community, people that I know have already in place some sort of relationship with the consumption of cannabis. And we are all coming together so that we can first plan how much is it that we need as a community. Okay, let's say I need 500 grams a month for the people that I've brought together. Now I go and I plan my supply. How am I going to supply those 500 grams? Am I going to grow outdoor? Because then that means I only have one season to grow in South Africa, and that I need to grow enough in that one season to supply that 500 grams a month up until the next season's harvest. So there's really a strict planning element involved in it to try and curb illegal activity from taking place within the club structure, because it would be really such a shame if we're trying to put this in place for the community to come together and assist each other and do this thing collectively around this plant that we all love. And then it just becomes like sort of a hole for any and everything to go. You know, that's not the purpose of it. And that's why the manual and firstly understanding the arguments within the manual that Brett touched on now, and then following that through with the systems part that I've designed, that's really going to guide your operations and what you're allowed to do within the club structure, and to ensure that you are recording all this data to prove that you are not dealing. You know, 5 years ago, if you had any records as an illicit dealer in cannabis, if you had any records of what went to who and how much money you got back, that was sort of the evidence to put you away. And now, if you're within this club structure, that's the evidence that's going to protect you. That's your proof that, look, I'm not dealing. It belongs to the members from the very beginning up until the end when it gets back to the member. So it's really important that the club structure does not go the bad way, and that it doesn't end up being a hub for all sorts of other illicit drugs. It's really important that it's only cannabis that is involved in this, and that you really closely follow this supply and demand process to ensure that you have that proof that, look, I am not dealing, there's nothing else involved in here. And according to this argument and all these documents that are very carefully prepared, I'm really trying my best to stay within the very little guideline that you've given me to operate in.
Thank you, Marleen. And maybe just still sticking with you for a little longer. What I'm maybe finding as well is that even internationally, the issue of these clubs is still quite contentious. Do you feel that that is maybe, one, the industry in general is still misunderstood in a lot of ways? Or do you feel that specifically these kind of social club models have not been explored enough? Or maybe, the courts are still grappling with understanding how this concept fits in with the international treaties, fits in with the local legislation and so on? Because recently in Spain as well, there was a judgment by the Supreme Court, I believe, that has basically left the social clubs in a state of flux regarding their legality. And, this is a sticking point. It's a constant challenge. And again, Spain has been renowned for having such models for a very long time, maybe comparatively, if you compare to South Africa. So do you think it's just generally the industry is misunderstood, or specifically these models have not really been broken down and understood well enough?
Okay, I'm going to speak a little bit to that, and then I'm going to give over to Brett to specifically speak to the what's happened in Spain, because I know he's really up to date on that whole situation. Mm-hmm. I think from my view, where cannabis clubs are not really high up on the priority list. I think there's a million other things that legislation wants to get in place regarding cannabis and creating a really holistic industry that we're just not that high up on the priority list. You know, this is recreational. It's within a realm that's still, you know, we have 100 years of prohibition to undo. That's really just brainwashed everyone involved with regards to what cannabis actually does for you and the harms associated with it, which I'm not saying there aren't any. I'm saying that it's really been overblown for a long time. And for us to get back to that balance of understanding the plant better, that's going to really be key. I think the next few years is education is going to be really important regarding all the aspects of cannabis, so that we can start making proper decisions about what are we allowed to do with it, within which industries are we allowed to do what specifically with the plant, so that we can get this club thing on the map. I think the only place really that speaks to allowing clubs and having clubs in place is Uruguay, which has a law specifically that they've passed for recreational cannabis. But as you said, we know about the clubs in Spain, and they've really done a whole lot of groundwork for the rest of us to be able to work off of some literature, off of some research that they've already done, mistakes that they've made that we have the benefit now of learning from, to just try and create something that can be recognized and that can be regulated, because we still, you know, we're trying to move this into a legal space. So we don't mind having regulations that we need to adhere to. We don't mind paying tax for the people that we employ. We don't mind contributing to the economy, but then allow us to do that within this structure that we have. So we sort of need that acknowledgement to be able to give back to the community and to the economy. But I think I'm going to give over to Brett to just speak about what's happening in Spain and how that sort of impacted our view of what may still lie ahead for us.
Thanks, Marleen. So, I mean, thanks. Yeah, I think that what's happening in Spain is very interesting right now. I mean, I know, Tidi, you've had an interesting journey there, and I know this. You're the one asking the questions here, but I'd love to talk either separately or hear some of your thoughts on what you experienced subsequent to this blow of a decision in the Catalonian High Court. Because as I understand it, there actually have been risks with cannabis social clubs. There has been significant abuse by organized crime groups of the club model in the streets of Barcelona. The mafias running a lot of these clubs, and a lot of them, certainly not all of them, not the ones that have the right intent behind them, but a lot of them. So the model itself, I think, has become, in many corners of Barcelona and the streets of Barcelona, and I'd love to hear what's your experience on the ground there, but as a means for organized crime groups to operate, and not just necessarily in illegal quantities of marijuana, but also other hard and harmful drugs. So I think that there is a valid argument that a lot of these clubs should be shut down. But I think that so many of them in the streets of Barcelona and in the streets of Johannesburg, Cape Town, Durban, whatnot in South Africa are a mere exercise of our rights to privately consume cannabis. So the question all comes down to one of how tight or light do you want your regulations to be? If at all, because if you accept that it's a manifestation of private use, this is not a legalized recreational market. This is just enough consumption by a member acting in concert with others to access their rights to do what they have the right to do anyway, but they, for example, can't grow the plant at home by themselves. Mm-hmm. So how do you regulate that? How it's an arguably intractable problem, because if you regulate it, do you just very likely recognize it in law and allow self-regulation to then happen, or do you regulate it a bit more tightly to say that the cops can come in once a year and inspect for quantities? It's a question of context. I understand, for example, Malta has now put in place quite detailed regulations for cannabis clubs. Mm-hmm. Now the question is that self-regulation at all? I would argue that it isn't. And so you have a whole body that's now been set up for the country of Malta, into which reporting of quantities and harm reduction policies, etc., needs to take place. And while that might be contextually appropriate to a tiny country with, I think, a few 100,000 people like Malta, a little island, in the context of South Africa, that would be ridiculous. And just be straight up legalization and regulation, and which we understand, and maybe we'll talk about later, is coming anyway in South Africa. So the question of private cannabis clubs for me is philosophically and practically a fascinating one, because it's really at the intersection of private use versus regulation of a market, and it's a question of what's contextually appropriate for your country, at the same time having to rule out organized crime activity, which often leads to violence and needs to be guarded against. So at its core, I think the private cannabis club model is definitely an important one, a worthwhile one, and a legitimate one. But I don't necessarily think that that some of them getting shut down, where it's clear that the quantity, irrespective of organized, where it's clearly in pursuit of organized and other crime, even just where it's just too obviously about recreational trade and retail, where huge quantities are being passed over and sold or under the guise of private use, then I believe that should be shut down. I think that's right. And so I don't think necessarily what's happening in Spain on the streets, and again, this I'd really love to hear if you have any input on this. I mean, this is your interview, but at any point separately, basically, there were like 400 or 500 clubs in the streets of Barcelona or in the total of Spain. If a few hundred of those are getting shut down because they promote organized crime, or it's just clearly not about people accessing the rights to cultivate and consume cannabis for their own private use, then I can't honestly say I think that's a bad thing. So until and unless they have a full commercial legalization of the market, in which you're talking about open and honest retail with licenses, which we will come in our case of South Africa, but it will take a few years. And I suppose maybe we'll talk about the development of that maybe here or yeah.
So I think it's a very interesting situation, because a lot of these issues are really born out of the prohibition of cannabis in the first place. So it's interesting how this is sort of a cycle where because it was prohibited, it obviously pushed it underground. Hence, we have the problem of the illicit market. And the social clubs, I believe, they present a structure where you can have an organized way to come together and, assist each other to grow cannabis, but also lend knowledge regarding the people that are participating that have such knowledge, but also particularly in a place like South Africa, where there are always questions and broader considerations regarding access to land and ability to grow your own cannabis. I think the cannabis social clubs do raise interesting opportunities, but also challenges as well. So again, it's interesting that, again, we're going back to the illegality situation where the model is being, or in some cases can be, used for wrong purposes. However, I don't think clamping, in some instances, I do understand clamping down is necessary where you do see those features and that the models are being used improperly. However, it comes again to the question of the right balance between having it being open and transparent, but also without inviting the state to, encroach on privacy considerations. And also, again, it can also leave a lot of groups particularly vulnerable as well if, the policing powers are not properly set out with proper guidelines, because again, things are always open for interpretation. And again, I don't think we are really in a place now where the police service has an acute understanding of the cannabis industry and how these things work. Specifically where Marleen discussed, now you've harvested. So obviously, if we're counting plants, you're going to find that the club has a substantial number at a particular time of the year. So that also comes into line. Well, that also then comes to also considering when are the inspections carried out, right? Can they be done at any time or at a particular point in the cycle? So I think it really comes down to a careful balance between having a transparent, open system, with the reporting measures, with the quality control, and also with the, proper social considerations as well, that you're not going to have people under 18 participating, and you're going to control how people access the model in a way that is contextualized. And again, in light of South Africa's particular situation and access to land challenges, I believe that this model does solve a lot of those challenges for a lot of South Africans. And Marleen, I also just wanted to get your opinion on this particular issue as well, where we know that a lot of the indigenous strains are particularly THC heavy. I mean, in terms of looking towards a way that a lot of the local farmers and indigenous growers can participate in the industry, is it your view that the Cannabis Social Clubs also provide an avenue for them to also maybe participate in the structure as well?
Yes, absolutely. I think that really goes back to the absolute heart of the model, is getting to the community, and that means all of the communities. And if we just look at legislation and how things have always come along, it's always the same people that are being left behind, right? And it's sort of unfair, because the guy at the taxi rank that I bought my bankies from in the illegal days, he's being left behind, but he's been doing this for so long. He should be one of the first ones to be allowed entry to the industry, because he already understands so much about what is needed and how supply and demand works, and all of the really good knowledge that the illicit market can offer us. It's for me a problem that indigenous communities and religious communities like the Rastas are, they've never really been identified as a community that can benefit from proper legislation. So the bill is obviously starting to talk to that a bit, which makes me really happy to see, just purely the fact that they are already included and there's something that speaks specifically to that group of people. That's great. A thing that Brett and I are starting to work on now, which in the last 2 weeks, I've probably had 4 different people approach me for this, is using the shared collective model that we've designed in a stokvel manner. So the stokvel concept is obviously really well known in South Africa, especially in the indigenous communities, due to the fact that, like, when apartheid was still rife in South Africa, Black people couldn't bank their money at the bank. So they sort of had to use their community to save and buy things together so that they could not spend as much money, pool their resources so that they can together provide for the whole community. And I think it would just make 100% sense to take cannabis and put it into that structure, with obviously proper guidelines on records that would need to be kept in place to also prove that this is not a dealing structure or a construct that's being used to facilitate illicit activity. And that would be something really nice to implement in the very rural areas. We don't have internet, we don't have cell phones, we don't have tablets, we don't have signals. It's really like you need to keep it pretty simple. Oftentimes people in those communities have not had the opportunity to get proper formal education. So you can't take them a whole thick file and say, hey, here's your thing, go and run, So I think our next challenge that we're starting to look into now is to create that model for that specific community, to also include them and stop this thing of leaving people and groups behind when we're making legislation. We have the medicinal sector, which is, that's a thing and a half, never mind the barriers to entry that Brett has touched on, just the millions of rands for the infrastructure, but also the ongoing inputs that you need to put in to ensure that operation runs properly. That's not something that's practical in the very rural Eastern Cape, for example, where, like I said, it's mountains and there's space to grow amazing cannabis, but we don't have the technology to facilitate a really formal process. So it's a project for me that's close to my heart for us to figure out, is how can we use the club model to bring it back to that specific community, because it can't be impossible. I mean, even if the bill speaks of 4 plants in your private space that you're allowed to grow. Well, fantastic. Then let's get every guy that has his little space to grow his 4 plants. Maybe we can help them grow proper genetics by giving the growers the clones that they can grow, and guiding them, getting one master grower, if I may use that term, to go around to all these places and help these guys, teach them how to grow proper quality cannabis, make proper products available to them within the Stokvel model that can help them to have an employment. You know, the club can employ them as employees that grow for the company. They are providing a service. So there could be the lease agreements in place, and through that they can earn money. They can earn revenue with a monthly salary that they can also use to plan their lives and plan how are they going to make it through this year. And then again, while having that thing of contributing back to the economy through UIF and payee and taxes and all the things that we need to legitimize us as individuals, as part of this country. You know, if we could create those solutions and take it to those people and just really give them something to work on that is legitimate within this club structure, I think that the club structure can be a really good solution for every community, from like very, very rural up to your high class Sandton clubs. You know, this really is something that you can mold and shape to fit what it is that you want to do within the guidelines that have been identified. So it would really be a lot easier if government would just say, yes, clubs, go and be clubs. It would be fantastic. And I wish that, like, it's my wish that it takes place and it happens for us. But in the meantime, we have to make solutions for people that have been left behind, because the only way to get them included is to already have them there and then go to government and say, look here, it works. We've been doing this for X amount of months. Here are the records. Here's the proof. Here's all the people that are partaking in this and busy contributing back to the economy. Please just give us the space to do what it is that we want to do.
That is actually a perfect way to end off the interview. Thank you, Marleen. I think you covered everything. And again, it's interesting how, you know, such models and such ways of organizing ourselves always are persistent, regardless of what the current, you know, legal establishment sets out. Clearly, it shows that there's something that is not being covered and that is not being dealt with, whether it's the supply, whether it's the demand that already exists. People tend to gravitate towards finding solutions regardless. And again, it's a question of, you know, the law catching up to where people are. But again, I think we're also quite fortunate to have yourself and Brett, who have already invested and given so much in terms of research and making the research available. So again, that also just speaks to the fact that, you know, you don't have to scratch your head. You're not starting from the beginning. The data is there. We have comparative models. And maybe this is just, you know, just a sidebar as well, where the adult use side of cannabis in many instances is misunderstood. I think there's always a premise that people depart from, and maybe sometimes these arguments are rooted in the international drug treaties that, you know, can only use it for medicinal purposes and such. However, this is probably a discussion for another time. There are also a lot of flexibilities in the international drug laws that do allow countries and member states to deviate in certain areas to create models that work for their particular society. So with that, I would like to know where I can find your model, your book, and if you could provide more information regarding how it can be accessed, that would also be great. And I would.
Oh, thank you so much. That's awesome. So the manual is available on my website. It's cradlestonequality.co.za, wherever you are. And it's only a printed physical copy. We don't have a digital copy available. But yes, it's on the website, it's available for you. And we really try to create a tool to empower communities to go and do this for themselves. So a common misconception that we have with the manual is Brett and I are not starting our own franchise of clubs, okay? If you buy this manual, it is really an educational tool for you to go and do this for yourself and pull me and Brett in where you need us. We come and we help you. And when we're done helping you, we go off on our merry way. We're not all up in your business. You're not reporting to us on anything that you're doing. We're really just a support structure that's trying to help as far as we can, because we don't want to go as far as to say that this is the way to do it. I think, again, that would also be very arrogant, because this is just our interpretation, and there's so many other interpretations out there that we're not trying to be prescriptive in any way in what the manual does. It's really just an empowerment and educational tool for you to go and understand, what does this construct of cannabis clubs look like, and what do you need to put in place for you to do this for yourself, and manage that within your own community. So it's available on the website. And like I said, we ship to wherever you are with the courier guy. So you'll get it within 3 to 4 days of your order being placed.
Oh, thank you. That's fantastic, Marleen. And Brett, any last words from your side?
No, thank you very much for doing this with us, Tidi. I think Marleen's captured it all very nicely. It's been wonderful. Thanks a lot.